Hey guys, tonight we begin with a ship full of British sailors who managed to turn a groundbreaking voyage of discovery into the world's first floating bachelor party. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been at sea for 8 months. 8 long, sticky, soul-crushing months. The food tastes like salted despair, the water could double as soup, and your bunk smells faintly of damp socks and regret. The crew has stopped talking about women and started hallucinating them in the grain of the wooden deck. Morale is somewhere between barely alive and we'd mutiny if we weren't so tired. Then, one morning, salvation. A green shimmer on the horizon. Tahiti. An island so lush it looks like someone painted it to mock you. As you get closer, the air changes. It smells like fruit, flowers and oxygen that hasn't been filtered through 40 British lungs. You're not sure whether to cry or just start swimming toward it. The locals are waiting for you on the beach, brown-skinned, laughing, and wearing roughly the same amount of clothing as a modern Instagram ad. They wave, smile and shout greetings, while you and your fellow sailors lean over the rail, suddenly rediscovering religion. Someone mutters, "Are we dead?" Someone else says, "If we are, don't tell the captain. Captain James Cook insists you're here for science, to observe the transit of Venus and advance the glory of the British Empire." You nod along solemnly, pretending to care about astronomy while staring at women who seem to exist purely to test your remaining self-control. Cook's talking about stars, but the only orbs anyone's focused on are much closer to sea level. When the longboats touch shore, paradise rushes to greet you. The Tahitians bring food, water, and smiles so warm it feels illegal. You, in turn, offer shiny metal trinkets and the world's worst haircut. The exchange is cheerful and innocent, for now. But deep down, you can already sense that something ridiculous is about to happen. As the sun sets, drums echo through the trees. The air is thick with roasted breadfruit and moral ambiguity. Cook stands on deck, gazing at the horizon like a man sensing disaster, but too British to admit it. You stare at the glowing island and think, this place might be the end of us. You're right. And it starts with a nail. Officially, you're here for science. You've travelled halfway across the world to observe the transit of Venus, which sounds impressive until you realise it just means watching a tiny dot move across the sun. Captain James Cook talks about it constantly, how this will change astronomy forever, how Britain's name will shine among the stars. You nod politely, pretending to care, while thinking about how long it's been since you've had a proper conversation that didn't involve salted pork. Cook is the model of Enlightenment discipline, steady, curious, and determined. Unfortunately, the crew is not. Within a day of landing, science has lost the popularity contest to Tahiti itself, which is quite frankly much more interesting than Venus. The island is warm, beautiful, and covered in people who don't seem to hate their lives. It's confusing. You spend your first few days setting up tents and instruments for astronomical observation, but your eyes keep drifting toward the beach. The local women paddle out in canoes, laughing, singing, and waving up at the ship. They're offering fruit, flowers, and something that makes every sailor on board forget how telescopes work. Cook, ever the professional, tries to keep things respectable. He insists on maintaining order, on keeping the mission purely scientific. But you and your crewmates are men who haven't seen women, warmth, or moral boundaries in months. The second cook turns his back. Half the ship is leaning over the rail like Victorian tourists in a fever dream. Then, someone makes a discovery that changes everything. The Tahitians love iron, not jewels, not gold, iron. To them, it's a treasure, a metal they can't make themselves. To you, it's a handful of nails and a moral dilemma you'll ignore immediately. Cook wants you to focus on the stars. But you've already found something much more fascinating. You're no longer studying Venus, you're bartering with it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that when paradise starts trading with a ship full of lonely men, science doesn't stand a chance. You step off the ship expecting formality, a cautious exchange of gifts, maybe some polite bowing, and a few anthropological observations. Instead, you're greeted by laughter, music, and the unmistakable realization that the people of Tahiti are living far better than anyone on your floating wooden coffin. They swarm around you with open arms and even more open smiles. The women wear flowers in their hair and about 3 square inches of fabric, which immediately destroys whatever moral backbone you had left. The men are friendly too, offering coconuts, roasted fish, and introductions you barely hear because you're too busy staring at the scenery. You attempt diplomacy, but it quickly devolves into confused hand gestures and nervous grinning. Someone offers a metal button, which earns a delighted squeal and a kiss on the cheek. Suddenly, every sailor realizes they've been sitting on a gold mine of British junk. Buttons, spoons, belt buckles. It all becomes currency in this new tropical economy of affection. But then, one of the women spots something else. A carpenter's iron nail glinting in the sun. Her eyes widen. She touches it gently, fascinated. To her, it's magic. Stronger than stone, sharper than bone, and more valuable than anything on the island. She points at it, smiles, and offers companionship. The sailor hesitates for roughly 3 seconds before making the trade. 1 nail for 1 night. History's least stable transaction. Word spreads faster than a venereal disease, which, incidentally, is now a growing concern. Within hours, nails vanish from storage, toolboxes, and eventually, the hull of the ship itself. You'd think someone would stop this. Perhaps a captain, or at least a man with basic survival instincts. But no. By sunset, the entire crew is conducting a roaring business in iron-based romance. It's capitalism meets chaos, and you're a proud participant. From the beach, the Tahitians laugh and dance beneath the torchlight, perfectly content. From the ship, you hear Cook's voice echoing across the water. Where in God's name are all my nails going? And somewhere between paradise and poor decision-making, you realize this expedition just stopped being about Venus. It's about anatomy now. It starts with one sailor, probably the kind who thinks reading is witchcraft. He hands over a small iron nail, maybe 2 inches long, to a smiling Tahitian woman. In return, she offers fruit, a flower garland, and then something that makes the rest of the crew's brains collectively shut down. No one records exactly what happens next, but the result is clear. Within minutes, iron has become the island's new gold standard. You stand nearby, pretending to be shocked, but mostly calculating how many nails you can borrow before the ship collapses. The crew catches on quickly. By sunset, the first official nail-based economy in the Pacific is thriving. The exchange rate? 2 nails for conversation, 3 for a kiss, and anything more requires tools from the carpenter's chest. Of course, Captain Cook is furious. He's a man of science, reason, and reinforced wood. Watching his crew dismantle the ship one flirtation at a time drives him mad. You can practically see him aging by the minute, standing on the deck, clutching his logbook like it's a Bible. He orders inspections, counts supplies, and reminds everyone that the HMS Endeavour is a vessel of exploration, not a floating brothel. But try explaining that to men who haven't touched a woman since the Prime Meridian. You might as well ask them to trade back. Every nail pulled from the hull is another small victory for lust and another step toward maritime disaster. Meanwhile, the Tahitians are thrilled. Iron tools change everything. Their knives get sharper, their fishing gear stronger, their houses sturdier. They think the British are the most generous visitors ever. They have no idea the generosity comes from a place of catastrophic stupidity. By the end of the week, you can hear the ship groaning in the night, quite literally. Each creak sounds like judgment. Cook starts pacing, muttering about discipline and moral decay, while you and the others pretend to fix the rigging with the remaining 2 nails left in existence. You came to study the heavens, but somehow you've bartered away the sky for flesh and folly. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first romantic supply chain issue. By now, the situation has spiraled into something between a carnival and an economic experiment gone horribly right. What began as a single trade has turned into a full-scale marketplace of questionable morals and even more questionable craftsmanship. You wake up one morning to find the beach crowded. Canoes line the shore, each carrying Tahitian women eager to negotiate, laugh, and, most importantly, shop. They arrive with flowers and fruit, ready to do business. The British sailors, once proud representatives of His Majesty's scientific curiosity, now look like desperate blacksmiths in a tropical bazaar. Nails, chisels, bits of iron, even the ship's hinges are suddenly trade goods. You stroll through this unholy flea market like a man visiting his own moral collapse. The crew haggles loudly, offering handfuls of iron for what the official report will later call favours of a personal nature. Every time someone pries another nail from the hull, the ship gets weaker, and the crew gets stronger in spirit, if not in ethics. Cook tries to impose order, of course. He posts guards, locks the supply stores, and threatens to flog anyone caught stealing nails. But you can't stop an economy built on hormones. Within hours, the guards are confiscating evidence for personal use. Cook writes another entry in his journal. The men are falling into moral ruin, which is the 18th century way of saying, my ship is literally disintegrating. Meanwhile, the Tahitians are thriving. They're building tools, carving ornaments, and cheerfully gossiping about the British, who seem determined to trade away everything except the captain's wig. They think it's all part of the exchange. Generosity for generosity. You, of course, know better. You're not witnessing cultural sharing. You're watching the slow-motion cannibalization of the Endeavour. By nightfall, the ship creaks like it's trying to warn you. The masts sway, the planks groan, and somewhere below deck, a rat probably wonders if it's time to abandon ship. But you're too busy bartering away civilization to care. You arrived in Tahiti to observe the stars. Now you're running an iron-based love economy, the first of its kind, and hopefully the last. By the end of the week, Captain James Cook looks like a man who's aged a decade and lost a ship, which, to be fair, he's halfway to doing. He paces the deck in silence, trying to pretend his crew hasn't turned a scientific expedition into the world's least discreet dating service. You can almost see the headache radiating off his skull like heat from a forge. Cook, ever the Enlightenment man, believes in reason. The crew, however, believes in opportunity. Specifically, the opportunity to trade anything that isn't nailed down. Unfortunately, that last part has become literal. Every day, another handful of nails disappears, and every night, another sailor returns to the ship looking both smug and slightly guilty. You try to look busy. You rearrange ropes, polish cannons, and occasionally squint at the sky to give the illusion of astronomy. But Cook isn't fooled. He knows. The logs are missing nails, the tools are gone, and the ship itself sounds like it's sighing in defeat. One afternoon, he calls everyone to the deck. His tone is calm, the kind of calm that precedes biblical wrath. "Gentlemen," he begins, "you will refrain from further barter of His Majesty's property for personal indulgence." He says it like a priest, performing last rites over the concept of common sense. You all nod obediently, you even salute, and within 20 minutes, someone's prying up a floorboard. Cook posts guards at the tool chests. The guards immediately discover they too have needs. Within hours, the captain's new security measures have joined the island economy. Cook's journal entries grow more desperate. "The men are slipping into depravity," he writes, which is putting it mildly. He knows that if this continues, there won't be enough nails left to keep the ship seaworthy, or to build the gallows he's now fantasizing about. At dinner, the officers discuss reinforcement strategies. Below deck, someone's quietly dismantling a hammock frame for trade. The contrast is poetic, if horrifying. You glance at Cook's face in the lamplight. His jaw clenches, his pen scratches, and somewhere deep in his soul, a small voice whispers, "I should have stayed in Yorkshire." It starts as a joke, a few missing nails here, a loose plank there, but soon it's not a joke. It's an epidemic. The ship is groaning like a man with gout, and you're standing on the deck pretending not to notice that the floor sounds increasingly optional. You'd think the men would stop, perhaps out of basic self-preservation. But no. When desperation and opportunity collide, logic takes a long walk off the starboard side. Each sailor is now an entrepreneur, prying iron from the hull, the tools, even the cooking pots. One man allegedly traded a hammerhead, another a hinge. Someone removed the nails from the captain's own cabin door, which is bold, suicidal, or both. Cook knows. He can hear the ship's joints popping in the night like arthritic knuckles. He doesn't sleep anymore. You sometimes see him on deck at dawn, staring at the island with a look that says, "I hate paradise." His scientific mission, to chart the heavens, has been replaced by a far more pressing question. How many nails are left before we sink? But the crew doesn't care. The iron fever has taken hold. Every successful trade feels like victory, a tropical gold rush powered entirely by lust and ignorance. You're all sweating, smiling, and inventing creative ways to explain missing ship parts. "It fell off, sir. The tide took it. The natives needed it for research." Meanwhile, the Tahitians are thriving. They now possess enough iron to build a small revolution. Their tools are sharper, their ornaments shinier, and their social lives considerably more exciting. They don't see exploitation, they see exchange. In their eyes, it's generosity for generosity, and they're winning the bargain. By now, the endeavour sounds like a man trying not to cough in church. The boards creak, the masts complain, and the captain looks like he's aged into another century. But you've stopped worrying. You're too far gone, another missionary of chaos in the empire of desire. You came to Tahiti to measure Venus. Instead, you've created a black market in hardware and hormones. The Royal Society would be proud. From the Tahitian point of view, you and your crew are entertaining. Strange, pale creatures wrapped in too much cloth, terrified of the sun, and inexplicably obsessed with small pieces of metal. You build everything out of wood, you pray before eating, and you keep shouting about something called God, a being who, judging by your behaviour, is clearly not supervising you closely. The Tahitians are generous by nature. They share food, laughter, and affection without shame or pretense. Their society is built on giving, a concept that confuses you almost as much as hygiene confuses them. When they offer fruit or company, they expect gratitude. You, of course, respond with nails. They don't understand why you value iron so little. To them, it's treasure, durable, useful, divine. You treat it like pocket change. When you trade nails for affection, they think it's charming, not degrading. In their minds, it's an exchange of equals. Desire for desire, generosity for generosity. No shame, no sin. Just two worlds meeting on their own terms. You, on the other hand, are British, which means you carry enough moral guilt to power a small empire. You've spent years being told that pleasure is suspicious and that the human body is mostly a trap set by Satan. So when paradise offers you everything you've been denied, your brain simply collapses under the weight of temptation and Protestantism. From the beach, the Tahitians laugh at your awkwardness. They see you stumble through their language, blush during greetings, and hide behind trees like anxious schoolboys. They don't see depravity. They see comedy. In fact, they probably think the endeavour is some kind of floating asylum that's finally found a place to rest. Meanwhile, you mistake their openness for invitation, their laughter for consent, and their trust for naivety. It's a cultural misunderstanding dressed up as a vacation. The Tahitians will remember your visit fondly, as the time when strange metal men brought iron, confusion, and endless entertainment. You'll remember it too, just with a lot more paperwork, shame, and hull damage. To them, you were guests. To you, they were a miracle. To history, you were a walking lesson in why some civilizations should never be left unsupervised. You tell yourself this is all for science. You're not fraternizing, you're conducting field research. After all, understanding native customs is vital to the progress of knowledge, especially the ones that involve flirtation and fruit baskets. You make notes in your journal, though it's mostly doodles and self-justifications written in shaky handwriting. Engaged in cultural observation, you scribble, which is British for made another terrible decision. The Tahitians, of course, are not confused. They see your crew's fumbling advances and think, well, at least they're enthusiastic. For them, generosity of the body is generosity of the spirit, an act of connection, not shame. For you, it's an act that will require divine forgiveness, and possibly a tetanus shot. It doesn't take long for both worlds to misunderstand each other completely. When you smile awkwardly after a trade, the Tahitians assume friendship. When you retreat to the ship in embarrassment, they assume rejection. When Cook orders everyone back to the vessel and bans unregulated social contact, the islanders think he's punishing you for bad manners, not bad morals. They can't fathom a culture that finds sin in laughter or guilt in pleasure. Cook, meanwhile, is unravelling. His logbook now reads like a sermon written by a man losing a chess game to temptation. The men continue to disgrace His Majesty, he writes, which is a polite way of saying everyone's drunk, half-naked and possibly married to coconuts. You try to look innocent whenever he walks by, but you smell like fruit, flowers and suspicion. By now, Tahiti is divided between amusement and fascination. They've started calling the British men of iron, which sounds noble until you realise it's mostly because you keep showing up covered in metal and confusion. Children follow you around, giggling every time you speak. Women wave from the shore like merchants greeting their best customers. The cultures don't blend, they collide. One side believes in freedom, the other in restraint, and somewhere in between lies a rapidly disintegrating ship. You came to observe celestial alignment, but what you've really witnessed is the cosmic comedy of two civilizations discovering just how incompatible they truly are. And you, of course, are taking notes for science. By this point, Captain James Cook has lost control of everything except his handwriting. The ship is falling apart, the men are half feral, and his so-called scientific mission has devolved into the 18th century equivalent of a spring break documentary. You can practically see the steam rising from his powdered wig. He begins each morning with the same ritual, staring at the island, breathing deeply, and muttering Latin words that probably translate to, "I hate my job." He tries to focus on the transit of Venus, but even the stars seem to be mocking him now, distant, uncooperative, and slightly blurry through his stress-induced migraine. The daily reports are grim. More missing nails. More fraternization. Someone even traded a compass bracket yesterday, which means navigation now depends entirely on good vibes and the direction of smoke from the beach fires. You can tell Cook is close to snapping, the kind of quiet fury only British officers and tea kettles achieve before whistling violently. One afternoon, he summons everyone to the deck. His voice trembles with that distinct tone of restrained rage that could strip paint off the hull. "You will," he says. "Cease this disgraceful conduct immediately." The crew nods like obedient children caught stealing biscuits, then immediately plan their next trades as soon as he turns his back. Cook tries everything. Curfews, guards, moral lectures. He even assigns an officer to oversee the integrity of ship materials, which lasts roughly 6 hours before the officer himself vanishes ashore with a handful of nails and a stupid grin. The irony is painful. The man documenting moral decay has to write it down with an ink pot nailed to the table, because otherwise someone will trade that too. His journal entries darken. "The crew degenerates into the basest behaviour," he writes. You can tell he's one paragraph away from drawing little skulls in the margins. By the week's end, Cook stops pretending. He's no longer an explorer or scientist. He's a desperate man guarding the last 20 nails holding his ship and sanity together. You glance at him during dinner, pale, silent, and visibly calculating whether marooning everyone would be easier than explaining this to the Admiralty. He's right. It probably would be. You know things have gone wrong when even the ship starts talking back. Every groan of timber, every shudder of the hull feels personal now, like the Endeavour herself is judging you. At night, when the trade winds moan through the rigging, it doesn't sound like the sea anymore. It sounds like the ship sighing, "You absolute idiots!" Cook is on edge. He walks the deck at dawn, running his hands along the railings like a man inspecting a patient on life support. The planks creak beneath his boots, not metaphorically but mechanically. Too many nails are gone. Too many beams are structurally optimistic. He orders repairs, but with what? You can't fix a ship that's been systematically dismantled to pay for romantic diplomacy. Down below, the carpenters are losing their minds. Every time they hammer in a new nail, it disappears within a day. The ship's hull is starting to look like a badly healed wound. There are whispered jokes that if a storm hits, you'll all end up floating home on planks of regret. The crew pretends not to notice. They whistle cheerfully, mend sails, and trade more nails. You, of course, keep a straight face. When Cook demands to know who's responsible for the missing hardware, everyone suddenly develops temporary amnesia. The captain doesn't buy it. He starts counting nails himself, muttering darkly like a man auditing the apocalypse. One evening, a gust of wind hits the ship hard, and a loud crack echoes from below deck. The crew freezes. Cook's face drains of colour. You can practically see the thought bubble above his head. We've bartered away our structural integrity. For a terrifying moment, it feels like the Endeavour might simply give up and become two smaller ships. Somehow, she holds together. Barely. Cook orders everyone to stop trading immediately, which works for approximately half an hour. You're British sailors in paradise. Obedience was never your strong suit. So the creaking continues. The ship groans, the captain seethes, and you can't shake the feeling that she's alive, and quietly plotting to sink herself out of sheer embarrassment. The moral of the story? Don't exchange essential ship parts for fleeting joy. The Pacific is deep, and Karma has excellent hearing. Eventually, even Cook realizes that diplomacy through bartering anatomy for iron can't last forever. He slams the ledger shut, declares an official end to all trading, and announces that any man caught exchanging His Majesty's property for personal satisfaction will face immediate punishment. You've heard that one before. It always sounds serious, right until someone remembers how warm the island is and how cold the brig is. Still, the atmosphere changes. The feasts stop. The laughter fades from the beach. The Tahitians don't understand what's wrong. They've welcomed you, fed you, entertained you, and suddenly you've all gone sullen and suspicious. From their perspective, you're the ones behaving strangely. From Cook's, you've been behaving strangely since landfall. The ban hits the crew like a hangover. One day you're living in tropical bliss. The next, you're rationing water and pretending to care about astronomy again. The evenings grow quiet. The drums stop. The canoes no longer circle the ship. For the first time in weeks, you can hear the ocean again. And it's not comforting. It sounds like guilt. The crew tries to distract itself. Some men polish cannons that haven't been fired. Others count supplies they didn't steal. You stare at the horizon and wonder if the stars you came to study are still laughing. Cook walks the deck at night, grim and silent, his face illuminated by the lantern glow of disappointment. He wanted enlightenment. He got whatever this is, anthropology with a body count. The Tahitians, meanwhile, are hurt but pragmatic. They understand scarcity, even emotional scarcity. They keep their distance, still smiling, but the warmth is gone. When they do trade, it's for coconuts, not companionship. The paradise you broke has quietly returned to normal. You're the ones who can't. At supper, the ship creaks again, reminding you that the moral cost wasn't the only one. You eat salted pork, chew in silence, and wonder if paradise ever forgives, or if it simply waits for the next fool to anchor offshore. You came seeking the heavens. Instead, you learned what happens when humanity meets temptation and forgets to bring enough nails home. The day finally comes when Cook announces it's time to leave. No fanfare, No ceremony. Just a grim note in the logbook, and a reminder that there are still, miraculously, a few nails left holding the ship together. You pack your things, pretend you're not heartbroken, and try not to make eye contact with the island that made you forget your duties, your morals, and your ship's warranty. The Tahitians gather along the beach to see you off. They wave and smile, not with anger, but with the calm acceptance of people who've seen travellers come and go, always promising to return, never meaning it. Some bring gifts, fruit, shells, flowers. You have nothing left to give them except awkward gestures and the vague hope that history won't record any of this too specifically. Cook stands at the bow, silent. His jaw is tight, his knuckles white on the railing. You can tell he's already rewriting the report in his head, replacing catastrophic moral breakdown with limited social contact. He wants to leave quickly, before the island's laughter follows him home. As the longboats push off, the water glimmers around the oars. The island grows smaller, but its colours stay burned into your mind. The green hills, the blue lagoons, the gold of the setting sun, and the faint echo of drums fading into the wind. You don't look back for long. No one does. It's easier to stare at the horizon than at the consequences. Back on deck, the Endeavour feels different, hollow, almost embarrassed. Every plank creaks like it remembers what you did. The sails snap in the wind, impatient, as if the ship itself is desperate to leave before she falls apart or files a complaint. Cook orders full sail. No one argues. As Tahiti vanishes behind you, you realise paradise doesn't punish. It just forgets you. You'll tell yourself you were explorers, men of science, seekers of truth. But deep down, you know what history will call you. The crew who traded the heavens for a handful of nails and a very brief vacation from civilization. The open sea has never looked so dull. After weeks of Tahitian sunlight, the Pacific feels grey, endless, and mildly judgmental. The smell of salt and sweat returns. The laughter fades. And for the first time in months you remember that the real world doesn't smell like fruit. It smells like rope, tar, and consequences. Cook is a new man now, quieter, sterner, and possibly one existential crisis away from setting the ship on fire. He spends most of his time writing, occasionally muttering words like discipline and never again. The rest of the officers follow suit, pretending that what happened in Tahiti was a cultural misunderstanding rather than a full-blown moral implosion. You all agree not to talk about it. Naturally, that means everyone will. The ship limps onward. Every groan of wood is a reminder that the hull is more wish than structure. The carpenters patch holes with scrap and prayer. Cook insists everything is under control, which in captain speak means absolutely doomed. You try to settle back into routine. The crew scrubs decks, repairs sails, and silently wonders if the Tahitians miss you, or if they're too busy forging tools from your ship parts to care. Nights are long and quiet now. No drums, no songs, just the creak of guilt and the occasional whisper of, "Worth it though." When you finally sight land again, not paradise this time, but some rocky, indifferent shore, the ship breathes a collective sigh. Civilization, that great comfort blanket of rules, taxes, and cold weather, is waiting to embrace you in its stiff grey arms. You should feel relieved. You don't. Stepping ashore feels like stepping back into a cage, one made of manners, uniforms, and the unspoken agreement that everyone will pretend the Pacific was purely scientific. Cook files his reports. You polish your boots. The Admiralty will call it a success, of course. Observations completed, maps drawn, stars recorded. No one will mention the nails, or the laughter, or the way paradise changed you and then quietly erased you. You left civilization once and found humanity. Now you've returned to civilization and left your humanity behind. You think the story will end when you dock, that the ocean will swallow your secrets, that the rumours will fade with the tide. You're wrong. Word spreads faster than scurvy. By the time you reach England, the tale of the British who traded nails for favours is already drifting through every port like smoke. Scandalous, hilarious, and completely unstoppable. The Admiralty pretends not to hear it. The Royal Society files Cook's report under astronomical success, carefully ignoring the pages that smell faintly of guilt and coconut oil. Cook himself refuses to discuss Tahiti at all. If anyone brings it up, he changes the subject to weather patterns or cannibalism, anything less awkward. You, however, can't escape it. Every tavern has a version of your story now. In one, the sailors were heroes, adored by island women for their bravery. In another, they were villains, corrupting paradise for pocket change. In truth, you were neither. You were just men, tired, curious, stupidly human, trying to find meaning in the middle of nowhere and settling for something cheaper. Years pass, and the story grows like a vine, wrapping around your reputation until it's the only thing people remember. Philosophers call it a lesson in moral decay. Sailors call it a good deal. The Tahitians, long after you're gone, forge their own legends, stories of strange visitors made of metal who came from the sea, offered gifts, and fell apart when faced with joy. You live on in footnotes and punchlines. Cook gets statues. You get anecdotes told by drunk historians in candlelit rooms. Somewhere, a lecturer gestures at a map and says, "And here, gentlemen, is where the British learned that desire and discipline make poor shipmates." Sometimes, late at night, you dream of Tahiti. The sunlight, the laughter, the smell of breadfruit roasting in the breeze. And when you wake to grey skies and the sound of rain on cobblestone, you can't tell if the memory is real or just guilt wearing a floral lei. Paradise forgot you. History didn't. And somewhere out there, a rusted nail lies buried in Tahitian sand. The only proof that you were ever foolish enough to think paradise would trade evenly. Monasteries were meant to be islands of holiness in a sea of sin, stone fortresses of chastity standing firm against the temptations of the flesh. Every monk and nun who passed through those heavy wooden doors left behind their old life, their family, their ambitions, and above all, their desires. In theory, these were the purest souls in Christendom, men and women who had turned their backs on lust, greed, and every human weakness. In reality, well, the flesh doesn't surrender as easily as parchment vows might suggest. The Church insisted that celibacy was a divine command, a sacred discipline that freed the soul from carnal distractions. It made priests and monks pure vessels through which God's grace could flow, uncorrupted by bodily indulgence. But human nature has never been a great fan of theological theory. Behind cloister walls, where men and women spent decades in close quarters, often isolated, sleep-deprived and half-starved, the battle between holiness and hormones was constant. Even the strictest orders, like the Cistercians and Carthusians, couldn't completely silence the murmur of temptation. Medieval manuscripts tell stories of monks confessing to impure dreams, of nuns flagellating themselves for thoughts unworthy of Christ's brides. Chroniclers, with a mix of pity and fascination, recorded these slips with careful wording, always implying that yes, even the most devout could fall. One monk admitted to seeing the Virgin Mary in every woman he encountered. A nun confessed that her heart raced more for the visiting confessor than for her saviour. To keep lust at bay, monasteries designed elaborate systems of control, strict silence, separate sleeping quarters, punishing schedules, and endless fasting. But paradoxically, the more the Church obsessed over purity, the more sin it seemed to find. Preachers thundered against the devil's temptations, yet the devil seemed to live quite comfortably in the cloisters. Visitors to monasteries sometimes joked that the walls were less to keep the world out than to keep scandal in. Behind those serene gardens and candle-lit chapels, passion often whispered in the dark, a forbidden warmth in a cold, pious world. The vow of celibacy was meant to elevate the spirit, but for many, it became a daily test of what it truly meant to be human. You might imagine monks spending their days serenely copying manuscripts, chanting psalms, and gardening under the gentle sun. But in reality, monasteries were social ecosystems, cramped, emotional, and filled with very human friction. The devil, it seems, didn't need to knock. He was already renting a cell. Temptation came in many forms. Sometimes it was the pilgrim women who arrived at the monastery gates seeking healing or confession, their eyes full of tears, and occasionally curiosity. Other times it came in the form of fellow novices, young men with soft hands and uncalloused consciences, or nuns with faces too angelic for their own good. The church might have demanded celibacy, but it never made monasteries co-ed for long, and that decision was no accident. Scandals had a way of spreading faster than incense smoke. Medieval bishops received endless reports of improper familiarity between clerics and lay visitors. Some abbots tried to suppress gossip, others pretended not to hear it. After all, it's hard to preach about resisting sin when Brother Thomas keeps sneaking out after Compline. Records from England and France mention monks caught entertaining women in guest rooms, confessors accused of turning confessionals into courting booths, and even entire convents that quietly relocated after too many miraculous births. And then there were the markets, those lively gatherings outside monastery gates where peasants sold food, merchants traded wine, and temptation smelled faintly of baked bread and sweat. Monks would visit to oversee supplies, but sometimes returned with more than grain. Chronicles describe friars caught drinking with tavern women or slipping out in secular attire. The irony wasn't lost on the people. Those who preached abstinence were often the first to be caught breaking it. Still, not every fall from grace was malicious. Some monks truly believed they'd found divine love in another person, a spiritual union that unfortunately tended to be very physical. They wept, confessed, and swore never to sin again, until the next full moon, when the cloister walls once again began to feel a little too small. The monastery was a fortress of faith, yes, but every fortress has cracks, and through those cracks, the world and its desires always found a way in. For all the church's talk of purity, the archives tell a different kind of story, one soaked in candlelight, confession, and the occasional screaming newborn. Forbidden love, it turned out, was not a rare occurrence, but an occupational hazard. When you locked young, lonely people behind stone walls and told them to think only of God, some inevitably began seeing the divine in each other's eyes. Chroniclers, trying to preserve the church's dignity, often wrapped these stories in euphemisms. A nun who fell into sin was code for pregnancy. A monk who disappeared for penance had likely been caught in bed with someone who wasn't Christ. And when convents reported mysterious cries in the night, they weren't talking about spiritual visions, they were hiding infants. Some monasteries even maintained hidden rooms or secret gardens, where unwanted babies were quietly delivered, and more quietly still, sent away to foundling homes. The 12th and 13th centuries were particularly ripe for such scandals. As monastic populations grew, so did opportunities for mischief. There's a recorded case in Yorkshire where an abbot fathered several children with local women and was still celebrated for his robust leadership. In Italy, a convent's confessor was accused of maintaining relationships with nearly half his penitents. The Inquisition had words for him, most of them unprintable in Latin. Of course, love stories also existed within the cloisters, genuine, painful, human ones. Letters between monks and nuns sometimes survive, full of longing and guilt. "I burned for you as for divine fire," one wrote, as if theology could excuse passion. Some lovers even tried to escape together, donning peasant clothes to start anew beyond the monastery walls. Most were caught, dragged back and humiliated. The church believed sin must be purged through shame. But shame only deepened the secrecy. Ironically, these forbidden affairs only made the monasteries more intriguing to outsiders. Rumours spread through villages. The Holy Sisters of St. Clare grow round with child every winter, or the monks of St. Bernard have more heirs than nobles. The holier the institution claimed to be, the juicier the gossip became. Behind the facade of sacred celibacy, there beat very mortal hearts. hearts that, despite every vow, still craved warmth, touch, and the dangerous comfort of love in the dark. By the high Middle Ages, the Church had grown tired of pretending that lust was just an occasional clerical hiccup. It was now an open war, an invisible, exhausting, and rather hypocritical war. Popes thundered against the sins of the flesh, while many of their own clerks maintained housekeepers, who suspiciously also bore their children. But hypocrisy is cheaper than honesty, and it fits neatly into a sermon. Canon law became a weapon. Councils met, pens scratched, and soon every priest, monk, and nun in Europe faced a mountain of prohibitions. The Lateran Council of 1139 officially banned priests from marrying, a bold move, considering how many already had wives. The policy was justified as spiritual purification, but it also had a convenient side effect. It kept church property from being passed down to clerical heirs. Celibacy, it turned out, wasn't just about holiness. It was about real estate. Punishments grew harsher. Monks caught in sin could be whipped, imprisoned, or sent to remote priories where temptation was unlikely, meaning cold, damp cells far from anything resembling a woman. Nuns found guilty of lust were sometimes sealed inside their convents for life, a practice called immuration. It sounds poetic until you realise it meant literally being bricked into a small room with a prayer slot. The Church called it repentance. Everyone else called it horrifying. Confession manuals from the 13th century read like grim romance novels. They list sins so specific that you can almost picture the scenes. Laying hands in affection, sharing bedding for warmth, thoughts of carnal delight during prayer. Each came with a penance, fasting, flogging, or endless repetition of psalms that probably didn't help much. But even with the Church's relentless policing, desire didn't die. It simply went underground. Passion became spiritualized, cloaked in metaphors of divine love. A monk might write of burning for God, while his eyes lingered a bit too long on the visiting nun. The holiest poetry often sounded suspiciously like a love letter. The war on desire was meant to purify the clergy, yet it only revealed how human they were. For all their vows, all their fasts, and all their punishments, no amount of incense could truly cover the scent of longing that hung over medieval Christendom. If the Church wanted purity, what it got instead were headlines, or at least the medieval version of them. Monastic scandals were the medieval equivalent of celebrity gossip, whispered through taverns, sung by minstrels, and scribbled in the margins of chronicles by monks who claimed to be deeply troubled while writing every sordid detail. Take the Abbey of Fontevraud, for instance, a mixed community of men and women under the rule of an abbess. You can guess how well that went. Within a few decades, rumours of unseemly behaviour surfaced, complete with allegations of monks sneaking into the nuns' dormitories after matins. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, responded by enforcing stricter walls, because nothing says problem solved like a little extra stone between you and temptation. Then there was the infamous scandal at the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Valery in France. The abbot was accused of keeping a mistress disguised as a female servant, who somehow managed to produce 3 children before anyone noticed. The bishop ordered an investigation, but after a generous donation from the abbey's treasury, the whole affair was quietly forgiven, proving that even sin had a price tag. Not to be outdone, the nuns of St. Clare's convent in Bologna made their own headlines when an inspection revealed several of them pregnant. Their defence? The devil visited us at night. Convenient, perhaps, but not exactly credible, when the devil was seen walking out the back gate wearing a monk's robe and carrying his sandals. And then there was the Cistercian monk in Germany, who confessed to fathering not 1, not 2, but 7 children. When asked if he felt remorse, he sighed, "Only that I must now pay for so many mouths." The chronicler noted this as a sign of weak repentance. Each scandal chipped away at the illusion of sanctity the Church worked so hard to maintain. For every miracle story spread to inspire faith, there seemed to be a monastery somewhere producing the opposite kind of legend. The cloister, once seen as heaven's waiting room, was increasingly viewed as a place where vows went to die and human nature refused to be exercised. Behind the hymns and holy chants, medieval monasteries were very much alive, and occasionally a little too lively. For all their vows of silence, medieval monks and nuns were remarkably eloquent when it came to forbidden affection. Love, it seemed, had its own liturgy. Between the psalms and the Latin chants, the cloisters produced a secret genre of writing, passionate letters that blurred the line between divine devotion and carnal craving. These weren't crude or careless exchanges. They were crafted with the same care as illuminated manuscripts, except the margins glowed with desire instead of gold. Monks wrote of holy affection that burns like the love of Christ, and nuns replied with lines that could make even a troubadour blush. In one preserved letter, a Cistercian brother confessed, "Your image returns to me in prayer. I kneel, but it is your name that escapes my lips." Theologically incorrect, yes, but undeniably poetic. This strange fusion of lust and sanctity birthed what scholars later called mystical eroticism. The body and soul, they reasoned, were not so easily separated. Passion could be a mirror of divine love. At least, that's what monks told themselves when caught with ink-stained fingers and trembling hands. The writings of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and later mystics spoke of Christ as a lover, the Church as his bride, and salvation as a kind of cosmic embrace. But when Brother Anselm started referring to Sister Agnes as his earthly vision of grace, everyone knew where the theology was headed. Some of these letters survived because confessors kept them as evidence. Others were copied, secretly of course, by the same scribes who couldn't resist the drama. One nun's diary from the Low Countries recounts her spiritual struggle after laying lips upon a fellow servant of God. She wrote that the kiss carried the warmth of Pentecost. That's one way to justify it. The Church tried to stomp out such language, labelling it heretical. But desire simply found new metaphors. Love became grace. Yearning became devotion. And I miss you became my soul thirsts for union. Underneath the pious wording, everyone knew what was really being said. The cloister might silence voices, but ink was harder to censor. Even within walls built for chastity, the pen, like the heart, had a habit of wandering. When lust slipped through the cloister gates, it rarely went unnoticed for long. The Church had an entire toolkit ready for moral cleanup, part punishment, part theatre. Nothing said, lesson learned, quite like being flogged in front of your peers while someone read the Psalms of Penitence over you. It was Christianity's version of public relations. Sin was bad, yes, but spectacle was good for discipline. Monks who confessed to fleshly weakness were usually treated like addicts of the soul. First came interrogation. Long, exhausting, and more psychological than spiritual. Confessors asked questions that bordered on obsessive. Where did the temptation begin? Was there touch? Was it repeated? You might think they were compiling moral statistics, but really it was just medieval gossip dressed up as theology. Then came the penance. The standard treatment involved fasting, flagellation, and isolation, ideally in a cell cold enough to kill any lingering desire. Repeat offenders were sometimes forced to wear special garments, rough wool that scratched the skin raw, reminding them that pleasure was the enemy. Some monks were demoted, others banished to remote hermitages for reflection, which usually meant dying of boredom and regret. Nuns fared worse. A nun who broke her vow of chastity could expect a lifetime of disgrace. If she became pregnant, the Church saw both her and the child as evidence of corruption. Babies born in convents were whisked away to foundling homes, while the mother was sentenced to public humiliation, stripped of her veil and paraded through the cloister for all to see. The sisters would chant psalms as she wept, an eerie ritual meant to purify by embarrassment. Some bishops took things further. There are records of clerical lovers being literally chained apart in separate cells, forced to pray daily for each other's salvation, a cruel sort of divine couples therapy. A few were even buried alive behind monastery walls, their sins sealed in stone. The Church called it justice, history calls it trauma. Still, despite the cruelty, confessions poured in. Perhaps guilt was stronger than fear. Or maybe, deep down, these monks and nuns believed that forgiveness was worth any price. After all, the soul could always repent, even if the flesh never truly forgot. For all its fiery sermons about chastity, the medieval church had a knack for selective blindness. The same bishop who thundered about the sins of the flesh on Sunday often returned to his manor that night to dine with his mistress and her conveniently orphaned children. Celibacy, it seemed, was a flexible rule, depending on how high your hat was. Records from cathedral towns across Europe tell of priests keeping housekeepers, which was the church's polite code for live-in lovers. These women cooked, cleaned, and, incidentally, kept the holy men company through long winters. Some clerics even passed these women and their children off as nieces or godchildren, though everyone in the parish knew better. The church tried to crack down on it with fines, excommunication threats, and the occasional public shaming, but enforcement was inconsistent. After all, who was going to excommunicate the bishop? Meanwhile, papal courts in Rome were not exactly models of restraint. Chronicles mention cardinals throwing lavish banquets with dancers, musicians and wine, enough to make Dionysus blush. Pope Sixtus IV was rumoured to have multiple illegitimate children. Alexander VI didn't bother with rumours at all. He just publicly acknowledged his mistresses. To the average monk starving in a freezing cell, this must have felt like divine mockery. Even the monasteries themselves profited from sin. Some abbots accepted donations from wealthy nobles caught in scandals, offering discreet penance in exchange for a generous sum. The more sinful your secret, the larger the donation expected. Forgiveness, it turned out, could be monetized quite nicely. A monk could starve himself for purity, but the abbot could feast on the proceeds of other people's lust. This hypocrisy created a strange moral double life. On paper, the church demanded absolute celibacy. No marriage, no intimacy, not even a lustful glance. But in practice, everyone from parish priests to cardinals had found creative loopholes. Sin wasn't eradicated. It was institutionalized, taxed, and occasionally blessed if the right purse changed hands. By the late Middle Ages, cynicism began to seep into the faith. How could the people trust a church that preached holiness while living in indulgence? When monks sinned, it was a scandal. When bishops did, it was politics. And somewhere between sermon and supper, the line between piety and pleasure vanished entirely. By the late Middle Ages, the church's dream of a sexless clergy had turned into a centuries-long balancing act between heaven and humanity. The monasteries still stood, their bells still tolled, and their chants still rose toward God. But inside those echoing halls, the struggle between desire and denial never ceased. Every monk who lashed himself for impure thoughts, every nun who whispered a guilty prayer in the dark, was part of the same endless cycle, trying to erase what made them human in order to become divine. The irony, of course, was that this very struggle made them more human than ever. The monks and nuns who stumbled, repented, and stumbled again weren't villains. They were the church's greatest contradiction. Souls yearning for purity while trapped in flesh that refused to cooperate. Medieval theologians wrote volumes on sin, temptation, and the devil's snares, but none could answer the simplest question. If God made man and woman, why would he punish them for what he created them to crave? In private, many clergy began to see lust not as the enemy of faith but as its mirror. The same passion that drove the body toward another could also drive the soul toward God. This was the seed of mysticism, that strange, intimate belief that divine love and human longing shared the same fire. Some saints wrote of union with God in language so sensual it could have scandalized a troubadour. Others simply accepted that holiness was not the absence of desire, but the mastery of it. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the idea of absolute celibacy began to fray. Reformers like Luther would later call it unnatural, a burden too heavy for even the holiest to bear. The Church had spent centuries trying to cage the human heart, but the heart, as always, refused to stay put. In the end, lust and celibacy weren't opposites at all. They were two sides of the same medieval coin. one that priests and nuns flipped every day in secret prayer, hoping it would land on salvation. But sometimes, as history so often shows, even the holiest hand can't stop trembling when it touches the flame. Victorian London was a city of two worlds, one bathed in gaslight, the other buried in candle smoke and whispers. By day, it dazzled with industry and empire. Carriages rattled down Pall Mall, chimney stacks puffed over the Thames, and gentlemen in top hats debated progress and morality over tea. But when the gas lamps dimmed and the fog rolled in from the river, another London awoke, one not found on any respectable map. This was the London of secret societies and forbidden clubs, where aristocrats, poets, occultists, and politicians sought pleasure, power, or enlightenment beyond the reach of polite society. Behind locked doors in Mayfair, or candlelit basements in Soho, rules were suspended and reputations left at the door. Members wore masks, used code names, and swore oaths that would have made their priests faint. Here, every sin was a ritual, and every ritual was a rebellion. Some societies were born from boredom, the kind only the elite could afford. The age of industrial triumph had made them rich but restless. A night of brandy and billiards was no longer enough. They craved something darker, something that felt like touching the forbidden. So they invented clubs where anything could happen, and often did. Men who preached morality by day toasted to decadence by night. Scholars quoted Latin hymns between pagan chants. Politicians who railed against sin commissioned Egyptian altars for their drawing rooms. London's police knew of these gatherings, of course, but discretion was part of the game. When half the House of Lords belonged to your membership list, it was wise not to ask too many questions. Still, rumours spread, of masked orgies in mansions, of séances that ended in hysteria, of young debutantes vanishing after attending philosophical dinners. The line between society and sorcery blurred under the haze of laudanum and candlelight. The Victorians prided themselves on restraint, yet their obsession with morality bred an equal and opposite hunger for transgression. The secret societies of London were the city's confession booth, a place to sin freely and whisper about it later in the language of mystery. The age of virtue, it turned out, was also the age of vice, and nowhere did the two dance closer than in the velvet shadows after midnight. The original Hellfire Club had died with the 18th century, or so polite society liked to think. Its founder, Sir Francis Dashwood, had scandalised England with his pagan rites, his mockery of religion, and his fondness for women who preferred chalices of wine to holy water. But in the smoggy heart of Victorian London, the old spirit stirred again. The age of steam had brought progress, yes, but it had also brought repression. And repression, like any pressure, needed a valve. By the 1860s, whispers spread through London's upper circles. The Hellfire Club was back. Not officially, of course. No club in Whitehall would dare register such a name. But in discreet letters and cryptic invitations sealed with red wax, the title resurfaced. The members were not libertine poets anymore, but industrialists, politicians, and noblemen who had grown tired of moral sermons. They called themselves the Phoenix Society, but the motto carved on their hidden meeting room door was unmistakable: Fais ce que tu voudras, do what thou wilt. Meetings took place in candlelit chambers beneath Mayfair mansions, or in abandoned railway tunnels repurposed for private discussion. The guests arrived masked, dressed in robes, carrying torches or brandy flasks depending on the evening's mood. The rituals combined blasphemy and theatre, mock masses, Latin chants twisted into toasts, and readings of forbidden texts by candlelight. The centrepiece was often a grand feast where indulgence was the only law: rich food, rare wines, and company that would scandalise any drawing room. But the Victorian Hellfire revival wasn't just about pleasure, it was about defiance. The members saw themselves as enlightened men breaking free from the suffocating grip of church and state. To them, sin was simply a social invention, and rebellion was philosophy made flesh. Of course, some took the idea further. There were reports of séances conducted mid-banquet, of symbolic sacrifices, and of noblemen swearing loyalty not to God but to the principle of liberty, often represented by a black goat or a winged statue of Lucifer. London's papers never dared name them, but the rumours were irresistible. In a city obsessed with propriety, nothing was more thrilling than the thought that behind every moral reformer's facade might lurk a member of the new Hellfire Club, polishing his halo by day, lighting candles to darker gods by night. If the Hellfire men worshipped indulgence, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor pursued illumination, though the difference was often more aesthetic than moral. Founded in the 1870s, the Brotherhood presented itself as a learned order devoted to the study of ancient wisdom, spiritual ascension, and the hidden forces of the universe. In practice, it was part university, part séance circle, and part metaphysical masquerade for those too clever to join a church, yet too restless to live without mystery. The Brotherhood drew its name from Luxor, the Egyptian city of the dead, a suitably theatrical choice for a society obsessed with resurrection, reincarnation, and secret power. Members believed that ancient Egypt had once possessed divine truths lost to the modern world, and that through ritual, meditation, and a healthy dose of exotic incense, those truths could be recovered. Their temples were draped in black velvet and gold sigils. Their rituals mixed hieroglyphic symbolism with Christian hymns and fragments of alchemy. Its founders, a curious mix of magicians, scholars, and con artists, claimed contact with ascended masters, invisible spirits who whispered cosmic knowledge through dreams. Some members genuinely sought enlightenment. Others, predictably, sought profit or seduction. The Brotherhood's lessons included astral projection, magnetism, and sexual polarity, which supposedly unlocked spiritual power but looked suspiciously like moral mischief under a different name. Membership was by invitation only, and the initiation rites were elaborate. Candidates were blindfolded, led through smoke-filled rooms, and sworn to secrecy under threat of spiritual damnation. Those who passed were given occult manuals filled with diagrams, star charts, and vague warnings about misusing the light. Even skeptics were impressed. It all had an irresistible mix of mysticism and melodrama. By the 1880s, the Brotherhood's influence reached across Europe and America, inspiring later groups like the Golden Dawn. Its members included authors, aristocrats, and the occasional stage magician hoping to add credibility to his act. To the public, they were visionaries. To the police, they were harmless eccentrics. But to London's gossip mills, they were something far juicier. Proof that the city's elite, for all their sermons about progress, still longed to touch the ancient shadows. In an empire ruled by reason, the Brotherhood of Luxor offered something far more intoxicating. The illusion that enlightenment could still be bought with a candle, a secret, and a little bit of darkness. If the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was the rehearsal, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was the main performance, a society so influential that its rituals shaped the entire occult revival of the Victorian age. Founded in 1887 by three Freemasons with a taste for mysticism, William Wynne Westcott, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, and William Robert Woodman, the Golden Dawn promised to merge science, magic, and spirituality into a single system. It was part religion, part theatre, and entirely irresistible to anyone bored with Sunday sermons. Unlike earlier secret clubs devoted to drunken debauchery, the Golden Dawn drew poets, scholars, and restless intellectuals, people who believed that hidden wisdom lay behind every symbol, and that the universe could be decoded like a sacred text. Their ranks included novelist Arthur Machen, poet W.B. Yeats, and later, the notorious Aleister Crowley, whose arrival alone could make any séance feel like a scandal waiting to happen. The rituals were exquisite in their complexity. Members wore coloured robes symbolising planetary forces, traced pentagrams in the air with ornate wands, and recited incantations drawn from Kabbalah, Egyptian mythology, and Christian mysticism. Each initiation represented a stage of enlightenment, and advancement required months of study and strict discipline, or at least the appearance of it. Meetings took place in candlelit temples decorated with mystical diagrams, alchemical tools, and Latin mottos like Scientia immutabilis, knowledge unchanging. But for all its high ideals, the Golden Dawn was not immune to very human flaws. Power struggles, rivalries, and accusations of misusing the magic plagued the order. Mathers, exiled in Paris, declared himself Imperator of the Secret Chiefs, while Crowley staged dramatic coups dressed in ritual robes. By the turn of the century, the society had splintered into competing factions, each claiming to be the true guardian of divine knowledge, all of them equally fond of melodrama. Still, the Golden Dawn left an indelible mark on Victorian culture. It fused mysticism with modernity, turning ancient superstition into something fashionable. In a world obsessed with reason and progress, it offered something far more dangerous. The idea that enlightenment didn't just belong to God or science, but could be summoned by candlelight and Latin verse, right in the heart of London. Not every secret gathering in Victorian London involved pentagrams and Egyptian gods. Some were far more mundane, and yet somehow even more scandalous. The gentlemen's clubs that dotted Pall Mall and St. James's were temples of exclusivity, where deals were whispered, alliances forged, and reputations destroyed over a glass of port and a cigar. Officially, these were bastions of refinement and intellect. Unofficially, they were dens of gossip, politics, and indulgence, thinly disguised as social fellowship. The Reform Club, the Athenaeum, and the Travellers were the respectable face of this world: marble staircases, mahogany reading rooms, and the illusion of moral superiority. But beneath the polished etiquette, there existed another layer: the shadow clubs, where propriety stopped at the door. Some catered to forbidden pleasures, others to political plotting, and a few to pastimes that blurred the line between eccentricity and sin. Take the Savile Club, beloved by artists and writers who delighted in mixing brilliance with bad behaviour, or the Cyprian's Club, rumoured to host the city's most discreet courtesans under the guise of musical evenings. The real thrill was always the same: being able to sin without consequence, shielded by wealth, status, and silence. Members prided themselves on never speaking of what they saw, a code enforced not by morality, but by mutual guilt. It wasn't just about vice. Power was the real currency. A word dropped over brandy at the Carlton, or a handshake at the Garrick could shape government policy, ruin a rival, or make a fortune overnight. The Victorian gentleman understood that real influence thrived not in Parliament, but in smoke-filled rooms where no minutes were kept and no reporters were allowed. Of course, the hypocrisy was delicious. These same men voted for purity laws, censored books, and lectured the public on virtue. Then they'd stroll back to their clubs for evenings of gambling, absinthe, and informal company. The working class had pubs. The aristocracy had respectability, and both served the same purpose. In a city obsessed with appearances, the gentlemen's clubs were mirrors of the empire itself, grand, exclusive, and endlessly corruptible. The front doors gleamed with brass and polish, but step inside after midnight, and you'd find the same thing the Hellfire men once promised: civilization's mask slipping, one glass at a time. Not all of Victorian London's secret societies were devoted to sin. Some, in true British fashion, preferred to intellectualize their obsession with the supernatural. Enter the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882. A respectable organization dedicated to studying ghosts, telepathy, seances, and spiritual phenomena with scientific precision. Or at least as scientific as one can be while chasing ectoplasm through candlelit parlours. Its members included professors from Cambridge, theologians, doctors, and the occasional eccentric aristocrat who had grown bored of fox hunting. Their mission sounded noble: to separate fraud from fact, illusion from evidence. Yet for all their scholarly tone, the Society's meetings often resembled polite seances with better Latin pronunciation. They investigated haunted houses, analysed reports of spectral apparitions, and attended spiritualist sittings where mediums summoned the dearly departed, or more often, their own theatrical talents. The Victorians were obsessed with death and what lay beyond it. Industrial progress had conquered the material world, but grief was a problem science couldn't fix. Every home seemed to hide a portrait draped in black or a lock of hair sealed in glass. The society offered comfort disguised as curiosity. If ghosts could be proven real, then perhaps no one truly died. Their experiments were thorough, sometimes absurdly so. Investigators weighed mediums before and after trances to detect the mass of spirit materialization. They devised codes to communicate with ghosts, tested telepathy using playing cards, and sent letters to themselves in sealed envelopes to be opened only upon successful clairvoyant prediction. Spoiler: most envelopes stayed sealed. Still, not everyone dismissed their work. Some findings, like accounts of near-death experiences or unexplained coincidences, hinted at mysteries science couldn't easily explain. Even skeptics were drawn to the excitement. The great scientist William Crookes attended seances, convinced that spiritual forces might simply be undiscovered laws of physics. Of course, the line between researcher and believer was perilously thin. Many society members who began as skeptics ended up true converts after personal encounters. And when exposed frauds occasionally embarrassed them, the faithful simply shrugged. After all, every religion has its false prophets. In the end, the Society for Psychical Research reflected its age perfectly. A world desperate to believe that reason and mystery could coexist. That one might still reach heaven, not through prayer or sin, but through meticulous note-taking and candlelight. By the 1890s, London's fascination with the occult had gone from whispered curiosity to a full-blown underground movement, and no figure embodied that transformation more completely than Aleister Crowley. To some, he was a mystic and a poet. To others, he was the devil in silk slippers. Either way, he made sure everyone was talking about him. Crowley was a Golden Dawn initiate gone rogue, the black sheep of Victorian mysticism. Brilliant, arrogant, and utterly unrestrained, he treated magic as both science and spectacle. Where others saw symbols, he saw opportunities for scandal. He mixed Kabbalah with mountain climbing, yoga with ritual sex, and Christianity with blasphemy, creating his own philosophy, Thelema. Its core commandment, do what thou wilt, was practically a Victorian middle finger to everything the age held sacred. Crowley's London became a web of hidden flats and secret chambers, some filled with incense and esoteric texts, others with drugs, exotic lovers, and curious disciples. He attracted poets, actors, aristocrats, and thrill-seekers who craved rebellion disguised as revelation. His rituals blended ancient Egyptian invocations with sensual theatre. Candles burned beside bowls of opium, participants chanted while painted with sigils, and somewhere between ecstasy and exhaustion, they claimed to touch the divine. The press loved him, or rather, loved to hate him. Tabloids dubbed him the wickedest man in the world, a title he wore with pride. Every scandal, from his supposed human sacrifices, never proven, to his open affairs, only increased his fame. Crowley once remarked that if the Victorians were truly moral, they wouldn't spend so much time reading about immorality. He wasn't wrong, yet beneath the scandal lay something profound. Crowley represented the exhaustion of an age that had built its soul on repression. While the church thundered about sin and science preached logic, Crowley and his followers sought meaning in extremes, in the very experiences society forbade. By the time the century turned, the occult underground was thriving, a strange cocktail of philosophy, performance, and defiance. Secret presses printed magical manuals, seances evolved into art, and London's spiritual rebels prepared to carry their torch into the new century. In a society obsessed with control, Crowley's chaos felt like liberation, proof that, for all its gaslight and manners, the Victorian age still couldn't exercise its wild, unholy heart. While men in velvet robes performed invocations and debated metaphysics by candlelight, Victorian women were quietly building secret circles of their own, and theirs were far more dangerous to the social order. Forbidden from universities, politics, and even property, women found in mysticism a backdoor to power. Beneath corsets and courtesy lay a hunger for control over something, even if that something was invisible. By the 1880s, women had infiltrated nearly every major occult society. The Golden Dawn, despite its Masonic roots, admitted them as equals, a revolutionary act for the era. There, women didn't just attend rituals, they led them. Florence Farr, an actress and magician, directed initiations with regal authority. Moina Mathers, wife of the order's founder, became its high priestess, performing Egyptian rites in elaborate robes that scandalized her peers. To polite society, they were eccentrics. To their followers, they were living conduits of divine power. For many Victorian women, the occult wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the only language available for ambition. Spiritualism offered them public voices as mediums, lecturers, and authors. Figures like Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant transformed séances into platforms for philosophy and politics. In candlelit parlours, these women spoke with spirits, and by doing so, learned to speak for themselves. Of course, not all circles were so empowering. Some societies treated women as vessels for male enlightenment, poetic phrasing for exploitation. The so-called Temple of Venus promised spiritual purification through magnetic union, which translated neatly to the usual Victorian hypocrisy. Divine lust in the name of purity. Still, even these distorted movements showed a shift. Desire was no longer something whispered about in shame, but explored as a force of creation and freedom. The church condemned these women as heretics. The press mocked them as hysterics. Yet behind the laughter was fear. The sight of a woman in control of candles, symbols, and men's attention threatened every pillar of the Victorian world. By the century's end, the ladies of the veil had changed the face of mysticism. They turned séances into stages, ritual into protest, and secrecy into survival. Beneath the lace and incense, they weren't just conjuring spirits. They were summoning a new kind of woman, one who refused to stay silent, even when society tried to bury her beneath virtue. As the 19th century limped toward its end, so too did the golden age of secrecy. The veil of Victorian mystery was beginning to tear, tugged apart by scandal, exposure, and a modern world that refused to keep its mouth shut. Newspapers, once deferential to the aristocracy, had discovered that secret societies sold better than sermons. What had once been whispered in candlelight was now splashed across broadsheets, complete with lurid headlines and sketches of masked men clutching chalices. The public, half horrified and half enthralled, devoured every detail. Alleged orgies in Mayfair mansions, séances gone wrong, and aristocrats caught invoking the devil were irresistible tales for a population desperate to believe its betters were no better at all. When Aleister Crowley's exploits hit the press, moralists wept and printers cheered. The more the church condemned him, the more copies sold. The forbidden had become a commodity. The occult, the new theatre of the absurd. But something deeper was happening too. The dawn of the 20th century brought electric light, telephones, and Freud, and with them, a brutal kind of clarity. Mysticism gave way to psychology, séances to stage magic, and occult philosophy to early science fiction. The same candlelit rooms that once hosted invocations of Isis now hosted parlour tricks with electromagnets. The magic hadn't died, it had simply gone professional. Some secret societies adapted. The Golden Dawn's splinter groups persisted, modernizing their rites for a new, less forgiving world. Others faded into legend, their symbols tucked away in dusty trunks, their members swallowed by respectability. The era of gaslight secrecy was ending, replaced by a new kind of spectacle, one that no longer required masks, only headlines, yet the fascination never really disappeared. Even as London entered the age of reason, its heart still beat to the rhythm of the irrational. Every generation since has revived its own version of the secret order, drawn to the same old promise, that beyond the rules and the noise, there lies a hidden world where meaning, power, and desire still whisper together in the dark. In that sense, Victorian secrecy never truly died. It merely traded its velvet curtains for electric shadows, and its passwords for the eternal question that still haunts modern London. What, exactly, goes on behind closed doors? Philip the Fair, or Philippe le Bel, was the kind of monarch painters loved and courtiers feared. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as clear and unfeeling as polished ice. Chroniclers called him handsome as an angel, but angels, as everyone knew, could be terrifying. He embodied the ideal of medieval kingship, serene, pious, and disciplined. Yet behind that perfect exterior beat the heart of a man whose greatest temptation wasn't gold or women. It was power itself. Born in 1268, Philip grew up in a France rising toward glory. His father, Philip the Bold, had built a realm of wealth and ambition. His mother, Isabella of Aragon, had filled his early life with tales of chivalry and divine destiny. By the time the boy became king in 1285, he already believed his rule was ordained by heaven, and that opposing him was not just treason, but sin. The church taught humility, but Philip learned efficiency. The sword of justice, he believed, must be sharp enough to cut through the robes of priests. At first the people adored him. His bearing inspired awe, his reforms promised order, and his charisma hid his ruthlessness. He was called Le Roi de Fer, the Iron King, because his will never bent. But like iron, he was cold, rigid, and brittle beneath the surface. He demanded obedience from everyone, nobles, clergy, even the Pope. To his court, he was the perfect Christian monarch. To those who saw behind the mask, he was a calculating machine disguised as a man. His court at the Palais de la Cité gleamed with discipline and hypocrisy. While he condemned corruption, he surrounded himself with schemers. While he preached moral reform, his own household buzzed with rumour. His queen, Joan of Navarre, was devoted and intelligent, but her ladies were not so pious. Scandals involving her maids of honour and Philip's own sons hinted that even the royal chambers were not immune to sin. And yet, Philip kept his image spotless. His face remained serene, his words measured, his soul, at least in public, immaculate. But the same man who knelt in prayer before a golden crucifix would soon orchestrate one of the most ruthless betrayals in history, against the very knights sworn to defend that cross. Philip the Fair ruled France like a chessboard, every noble, priest, and peasant a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or replaced. But unlike a game, his board bled. His reign was marked by an endless contest with three rivals: the Pope, the bankers, and the Knights Templar. Each, in their own way, embodied what Philip desired most: authority without limits. His first great quarrel was with Pope Boniface VIII, a man as proud and cunning as Philip himself. The Church claimed spiritual supremacy over all monarchs. Philip believed God had delegated his power to France alone. Taxes on clergy, disputes over royal courts, trivial matters on paper, became ideological war. When the Pope dared issue a bull declaring that all kings are subject to the pontiff, Philip responded not with piety, but propaganda. He branded Boniface a heretic, accused him of sorcery and sodomy, and sent armed men to Italy. The Pope died soon after being humiliated and beaten, a convenient coincidence the king accepted as divine approval. With Rome subdued, Philip turned his gaze to gold. His wars and ambitions drained the treasury, and his need for wealth grew insatiable. He expelled the Jews from France, seizing their assets. Then came the Lombard bankers, accused of usury, their fortunes confiscated. Yet none of these seizures could satisfy him for long. There remained one institution richer, prouder, and holier than the crown itself: the Knights Templar. The Templars had once been crusading heroes, warrior monks whose swords had carved Christendom's empire in the east. But by Philip's time, they had become financiers, managing deposits and lending vast sums, even to the king himself. To Philip, debt was a humiliation. To the Templars, it was business. The Iron King despised both. In private, his advisors warned him that attacking the Templars meant defying God's warriors. But Philip saw only opportunity. If he could destroy them, their lands, treasure, and influence would all fall into his hands. And if he could cloak his greed in righteousness, accuse them of sin, heresy, and secret vice, then he would emerge not as a thief, but as a saviour. The mask of the most Christian king began to tighten, and behind its serene expression, something darker stirred, ambition sharpened by envy and piety weaponized by fear. It began quietly, with whispers, then letters, then the unmistakable smell of blood in the air. In 1305, Philip the Fair had already cowed the papacy by installing his own French Pope, Clement V, in Avignon. Now, with the church firmly in his pocket, he turned his full attention to the Templars. Their order, rich beyond imagination, controlled castles, estates, and vaults of gold across Europe. Worse still, they owed loyalty to no king, only to God. To Philip, that was treason wrapped in holiness. But how does a pious monarch destroy an army of monks without looking like the villain? Simple. Accuse them of heresy. The charge, once spoken, was poison, incurable, contagious, and conveniently vague. Heresy could mean anything: witchcraft, idolatry, blasphemy, or all three if the situation required drama. Philip's agents began collecting evidence, which mostly meant bribes, threats, and confessions whispered under the shadow of the sword. Rumours soon filled the streets of Paris that the Templars spat on the cross during initiation, that they kissed each other on forbidden parts of the body, that they worshipped a mysterious idol named Baphomet, a demonic head granting them wealth and protection. It was the perfect cocktail of horror and fascination for a deeply superstitious age. People wanted to believe it, and Philip wanted them to even more. On October 13th, 1307, a date chosen not for strategy, but for symbolism, Philip struck. Across France, hundreds of Templars were arrested at dawn in a coordinated sweep. Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself was taken from the temple in Paris, still half asleep, unaware that centuries of brotherhood were about to burn. Under torture, men confessed to anything. Iron spikes, fire, and the rack were the king's theologians now. Yes, they admitted, we denied Christ. Yes, we kissed idols. Yes, we sinned. And each confession, wrung from agony, became another nail in the Templars' coffin. Philip declared it divine justice. The people, awed and terrified, agreed. Only a few whispered what everyone suspected, that the real devil in this story didn't live in the Templars' temples, but in the marble halls of the Louvre, wearing a crown and smiling like a saint. The arrests were only the beginning. The real theatre of Philip's vengeance would unfold over years, a spectacle of corruption dressed as justice. The trial of the Templars became Europe's grandest act of hypocrisy, staged under the banners of faith and purity, but directed entirely by greed. What began as an inquisition soon turned into a grotesque parade of confessions, retractions, and executions, each designed to feed the king's appetite for legitimacy. In Paris, rows of gaunt knights stood before inquisitors in candlelit halls that smelled of sweat and iron. Torture had done its work. Confessions flowed like wine, and truth was drowned in it. Some claimed they worshipped a cat. Others swore they spat on the cross to test their faith. A few simply begged for death. The records read like madness, but to Philip's lawyers, they were divine revelation. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, proud even in chains, denied the charges once the torture stopped. His defiance unsettled the court. Here was a man who had fought for Christ in Jerusalem, now accused of loving the devil in Paris, and yet he refused to tremble. Philip, furious, ordered more pressure, more pain, more evidence. The king's scribes produced volumes of accusations, but none of it could mask the truth. The Templars' real sin was being richer and freer than the crown. The Pope, Clement V, found himself trapped. Installed by Philip, He now served as little more than a papal secretary in royal robes. When the king demanded the dissolution of the Templar order, Clement hesitated, and then, inevitably, obeyed. In 1312, the church officially disbanded the Templars, transferring their lands to the rival order of the Hospitallers. But somehow, the wealth itself found its way into royal coffers, as if by divine convenience. Public burnings followed, not for heresy, but for theatre. Crowds gathered to watch knights in white robes consumed by flames, their cries rising over Paris like prayers twisted into curses. It was justice, they were told. But justice does not scream. Philip stood apart, silent and expressionless, his pale face glowing in the firelight. To the people, he was the avenger of Christ. To those who looked closer, he was something else entirely, a man who had found heaven's language useful for speaking hell's desires. Philip the Fair ruled his kingdom like a confessor, stern, immaculate, and merciless. He outlawed prostitution in Paris, condemned blasphemy, and fined nobles for unchristian excess. But behind the sanctimonious facade, whispers grew of a monarch who indulged in the very temptations he so publicly condemned. He was not a glutton or a drunkard. His vices were subtler, born of control, not chaos. His true lust was for domination, of men, of faith, and, when rumour was kind enough to whisper it, of flesh. Chroniclers avoided scandal when writing about kings, but even they couldn't ignore the contradictions that haunted Philip's reign. He held himself as the image of chastity, yet filled his court with young courtiers, whose loyalty was rewarded with gifts, titles, and proximity. One account from the Burgundian archives speaks of the king's fondness for beauty among his attendants, a phrase that centuries later would be read with knowing smirks. The palace corridors of the Louvre became a theatre of whispered admiration and carefully contained desire. His marriage to Joan of Navarre was dutiful but cold. She was intelligent, devoted, and pious, qualities that only made Philip's emotional distance sting more. He treated her not as a wife, but as another vassal to be managed. Yet her ladies-in-waiting became the focus of many rumours. Courtiers told tales of candle-lit suppers, of confessions that lingered too long, of the king's hand brushing too near forbidden silks. Whether these were truths or slanders, no one dared say. In Philip's France, gossip could be a death sentence. Even the scandal involving his son's wives, the infamous Tour de Nesle affair, cast a shadow back toward the king himself. While Philip ordered the imprisonment of his daughters-in-law for adultery, many saw in his fury not moral outrage, but projection. His obsession with purity was almost pathological, as if punishing others could cleanse the guilt he would never admit. Perhaps the greatest irony was that the man who executed the Templars for secret vices was himself consumed by invisible ones. His was not the lust of the body, but of the soul, the craving to bend all virtue, beauty, and belief to his own will. And in that pursuit, Philip the Fair proved that sin wears many faces, and holiness is sometimes the most seductive of them all. In March 1314, the chill wind that swept across the Ile de la Cité carried with it the smell of burning flesh and divine irony. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, stood bound to a stake on the Seine's edge. He had spent 7 years in chains, enduring trials, torture, and humiliation, and now, condemned by a king who called himself God's avenger, he was to meet his end as a heretic. But as the flames climbed higher, de Molay did something Philip the Fair hadn't anticipated. He spoke. "Pope Clement," he cried, "and King Philip, within the year you shall answer before God for your crimes." It was a curse uttered not in rage, but in calm conviction. Witnesses later claimed that the old knight stared directly into the sunset, as if addressing heaven itself. Those who watched swore that Philip turned pale, though he dismissed the words as superstition. After all, curses were for peasants and priests, not for kings. Yet the months that followed began to feel uncanny. Pope Clement V died within 33 days, choking on his own blood during Mass. Soon after, A lightning strike set his embalmed corpse ablaze, a detail that chroniclers eagerly recorded as divine punctuation. And by November of that same year, Philip himself was dead, felled by a sudden stroke while hunting in the forest of Fontainebleau. The Iron King, conqueror of popes and knights alike, was gone at 46, his body as rigid and cold in death as his soul had been in life. The people of France whispered that the curse had come true. Some claimed to see de Molay's ghost on the banks of the Seine, his charred figure pointing toward the royal palace. Others said the Templars' treasure had vanished not through theft, but through sorcery, taken by angels or demons to await their revenge. Even Philip's dynasty seemed touched by ruin. Within 14 years, all 3 of his sons were dead without heirs, ending the direct Capetian line. Historians would later call it coincidence. The church called it mystery. But the people of France knew better. They said the Templars' God had answered, and that no amount of royal piety could wash the blood from Philip's hands. The death of Philip the Fair did not end his story. It simply began his dynasty's slow, almost theatrical collapse. His 3 sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, inherited his golden throne but not his iron will. The curse of Jacques de Molay seemed to have settled over them like a fog, invisible, silent, and deadly. Within 14 years, the direct Capetian line, which had ruled France for more than 3 centuries, was extinguished. It was as if divine justice had simply waited for the last echo of Philip's arrogance to fade before striking. Louis X, called the Quarrelsome, reigned barely 2 years. He inherited his father's coldness without his intelligence. Obsessed with legitimacy, he sought to cleanse the scandals that had plagued the royal family, beginning with his wife, Margaret of Burgundy, who had been imprisoned for adultery in the notorious Tour de Nesle affair. She died under suspicious circumstances, suffocated perhaps by order of her husband. Months later, Louis himself dropped dead after drinking a cup of chilled wine. Some said poison, others divine retribution. Philip V, known as the Tall, seized the throne from his niece, the infant daughter of Louis, claiming that no woman could inherit France. His reign was shadowed by famine, plague, and endless unrest. He left no male heir. When he died in 1322, the curse's noose tightened further. Charles IV, the Fair, named for his resemblance to his father, ruled last. He too had no sons. In 1328, his sudden death ended the Capetian dynasty. The throne passed to the Valois branch, distant cousins whose claim was contested by England, a dispute that would ignite the 100 Years' War. Chroniclers whispered that each king had been haunted by the same dream, an old knight in burning robes, staring silently through the flames. Priests called it the devil's trick. Peasants called it justice. Either way, the line of Philip the Fair was erased as efficiently as he had erased the Templars. The Iron King had sought to purify France with fire, and in doing so, had cursed his bloodline to burn with him. Power had been his god, and like all false gods, it demanded a sacrifice. In the end, that sacrifice was his name. History remembers Philip the Fair as the man who broke the Knights Templar and bent the papacy to his will, a monarch so powerful that even the church trembled before him. Yet his legacy is a paradox. A king hailed as the architect of modern France, but also condemned as its coldest soul. His reforms strengthened royal administration, standardized coinage, and centralized justice. But every decree, every polished policy, carried the scent of fear. Philip's idea of order was absolute obedience, and his kingdom became a mirror of his mind, efficient, rich, and utterly without mercy. Under his rule, the machinery of the state was perfected. The bureaucracy flourished, taxes became systematic, and the monarchy's grip on France tightened like a vice. Even the language of power changed. Law replaced faith, and the crown replaced the altar. To his admirers, Philip was the first modern king, one who ruled by logic, not superstition. To his enemies, he was the man who replaced the soul of France with a ledger. His methods set a precedent that would echo for centuries. Later kings, from the calculating Louis XI to the divine Louis XIV, would inherit Philip's obsession with control. The idea that the monarch was answerable to no one, not even God, began here. Philip didn't just rule France. He redesigned it in his image, beautiful, disciplined, and cruel. Yet beneath the veneer of reason lay rot. The destruction of the Templars, the persecution of Jews and bankers, the manipulation of religion. These were not the works of a reformer, but of a man terrified of forces he couldn't control. He dressed his greed in righteousness, his vengeance in virtue. The result was a kingdom outwardly golden, but spiritually hollow. Even his allies found him unnerving. One chronicler wrote, "He was neither man nor beast, but a statue carved to resemble both." Philip's death marked the end of medieval kingship's illusions. After him, monarchs could no longer claim holiness without suspicion. The fires that consumed the Templars had burned the halo off the crown itself. In the centuries that followed, France would rise, fall, and rise again, but always under the shadow of Philip the Fair, the handsome king who taught his nation that power, once worshipped, becomes its own religion. 7 centuries after his death, the figure of Philip the Fair still glimmers, half halo, half shadow. To some, he remains the great modernizer who dragged France out of medieval chaos and into bureaucratic order. To others, he is the betrayer king whose ambitions scorched everything sacred, the Templars, the papacy, even his own bloodline. History, like the man himself, cannot decide whether to admire him or flinch from his gaze. Chroniclers of his age tried to describe him and failed. They called him just yet cruel, devout yet godless, beautiful yet terrifying. Dante, writing from afar, placed him in Inferno's circles of the damned, a scourge upon the church. Later historians called him the first absolute monarch, the template for tyranny disguised as virtue. It is almost poetic that a king so obsessed with divine perfection became the perfect example of its corruption. His policies endured long after his bones turned to dust. The papacy's humiliation in Avignon, the fall of the Templars, the consolidation of royal justice, all set the stage for the powerful, centralized France that would one day call itself a nation. But his success came at a spiritual cost. The bond between crown and altar, once sacred, was shattered. After Philip, faith could no longer restrain kings. It could only serve them. Legends say the curse of Jacques de Molay haunted every generation that followed. Fires, wars, betrayals, each echoing the flames on the Seine. Even in the Revolution, when Louis XVI mounted the scaffold, some whispered that the Templars' vengeance had finally found its end. Perhaps it was mere coincidence. Or perhaps Philip's sin had simply outlived his dynasty, woven into France itself like a scar that never healed. Today, Philip the Fair's marble effigy still lies in Saint-Denis, serene, perfect, untouchable. He looks every inch the saint he pretended to be, but the silence carved into his face feels less like peace and more like denial. For all his brilliance, he never understood one truth, that fear is a brittle foundation for greatness, and power gained through cruelty is never truly kept. History does not forgive easily, and in its judgment, Philip the Fair remains what he always was, beautiful, brilliant, and damned.